It's Tuesday, July 22nd, and we have a pretty typical summer weather pattern building across the US, with our severe weather being situated mostly up here in the northern plains and a big ridge digging in over the central plains in the Mississippi River Valley, bringing some record-breaking temperatures to the region. We do have a slight risk up here in parts of the northern Midwest with an associated marginal risk, which spans all the way up into the Michigan Peninsula, then back into parts of the central and northern plains. Then we also have a small marginal risk down here, which is pretty conditional in parts of the southeast. Like most setups during this time of year, our setup is going to be wind driven. We have a hatched 15% chance of some damaging winds up here in parts of the northern Midwest, mostly going to be centered on central Minnesota. And in this region, we could see some damaging gusts upwards of 70 miles an hour today. Then we have a pretty conditional 5% risk, which spans our entire marginal risk area up here. So anywhere in that, we could see some 60-mile-an-hour damaging gusts. And the same thing goes down here for our conditional 5% risk area down here in the southeast, which covers the southeastern corner of South Carolina and then most of Georgia. Then our hail risk is going to be confined entirely to our northern plains and northern Midwest risk area, where we have a hatched 15% chance of some large hail today up here. We could see anywhere between 1.5 to 2.5 inches of hail in diameter. And then we have that conditional 5% chance, which is just for anything upwards of 3/4 of an inch. And we do actually have the conditional 2% tornado risk out here today, centered on parts of northeastern South Dakota, southeastern North Dakota, then a large chunk of central Minnesota, where we could see a couple of spin up tornadoes along a line of some severe thunderstorms. Now, talking about that heat wave that I mentioned at the beginning of the video, the hardest hit part of the US are going to be down in the southeast, then out into the Mississippi River Valley, and even into some parts of the southern plains. We're going to see that our feels like temperatures in much of the southeast are going to be anywhere between the low to mid 100s, with a couple of areas eclipsing feels like temperatures of 107, specifically at the South Carolina and Georgia meeting point on the Atlantic coast. And then as we go further in the day, our risk for some very hot feels like temperatures is going to shift a bit more west to more of that southern plains risk area in Mississippi River Valley, where we're once again going to see a lot of low to mid 100s feels like temperatures. And there is the chance of some flooding out here today. I think the main risk area is going to be up here in parts of the northern Midwest, where I do think a dangerous flooding threat could possibly develop. Down here in parts of the southeast, there's a pretty big conditional chance for some high rainfall amounts, with a focus on that South Carolina south border to the South Carolina north border. Then we have another area out here in the southwest, which should receive quite a bit of rain, but it will be enhanced by the mountainous terrain out here in parts of New Mexico and even back into Arizona, with our slight risk being the highest risk areas, receiving anywhere between 2 to 5 inches rainfall, then our marginal risk receiving anywhere between 1 to 2 inches of rainfall. Now here's a look at our rainfall amounts up here in the northern plains to northern Midwest, and we're going to see that rain is going to start early Monday night and push into early this morning, and it's pretty much going to rain all day across the region, with a large area from eastern North Dakota all the way up into parts of northern Minnesota already being covered with a large swath of 1 to 2 inches of rain. Then in the afternoon, we're going to see more thunderstorms across the region, and that is when that dangerous flooding threat is really going to kick in. We could see large swaths receiving anywhere between 3 to 6 inches of rain, specifically out here in Minnesota and even parts of northwestern Wisconsin. There is actually going to be a focus Wednesday morning of an area receiving possibly even up to 10 inches of rainfall down here in northwestern Wisconsin. So this is definitely something to be aware of. In our southeastern risk area, we're just going to see some widespread areas receiving 1 to 2 inches of rain, with a couple of isolated blotches being anywhere between 3 to 4 inches. And then in the southwest, our rain totals aren't actually going to be that high. At the most, we could see some isolated areas receiving 3 inches, but it's just going to be widespread 1 to 2 inches of rain. But this threat is mostly going to be boosted by the mountainous terrain. Here is our simulated reflectivity for our northern plains risk area, and we can see that we're going to have a fairly strong mesoscale convective system or strong line of storms push into Minnesota in the early morning hours today. And this is going to bring a lot of rainfall, some damaging winds, and possibly even some small hail this morning. This would be our first round of storms, and it's actually going to leave a outflow boundary along the region, which is going to be very important for how our severe weather threat will develop in the afternoon. We're going to see that we have a mesoscale convective system moving northeast into parts of North Dakota and eventually Minnesota. And this is actually going to develop along the outflow boundary with the help of a shortwave and some troughing up here as well. And this could possibly bring the threat of a couple of tornadoes because it will be along that boundary. And then there's actually going to be a secondary front down here into parts of South Dakota, but mainly because these storms are going to be along the outflow boundary, they could pose that risk for all hazards of severe weather. So potentially some strong damaging gusts in excess of 70 miles an hour, possibly some large hail in excess of 1.5 inches in diameter, and possibly a couple of weak spin up tornadoes, which would be fairly short lived. A couple other clusters to talk about are going to be back here in more western parts of our northern plains. We could see a couple of isolated discrete cells back here in Montana, which would be mostly high based and just bring the isolated threat for some damaging winds and some large hail. Then we could have a couple of clusters or mesoscale convective systems form even in parts of western South Dakota with the help of some frontal activity in our upper plains convergence zone and some flow aloft. And these could also bring that threat for some hail, potentially large, and then that damaging wind threat as well. Now, for some more conditional stuff, which isn't really certain on if it will happen, we could see this mesoscale convective system crash into an outflow boundary left by our main cluster storms back here in Minnesota. And when this happens, we could see quite a bit of development along the outflow boundary, possibly with some severe characteristics. But these setups along outflow boundaries, especially at night, sometimes don't pan out in the real world, but definitely something to be aware of for people along the border of the Dakotas and even Minnesota. Then for other areas which aren't our main risk of severe weather, but could possibly see that threat of severe weather, first is going to be down here in the Central Plains, specifically in the upper plains and parts of western Nebraska and northeastern Colorado, where we could see a couple of storms bring that damaging wind threat and possibly some small hail. Another area to watch is going to be out here in the southeast, where there is going to be some frontal activity and probably a couple of embedded low pressure systems back here, which could bring a couple of severe storms in this moist and unstable environment, even down into Florida. And our last area with a conditional threat is, of course, going to be out here in the southwest, where it looks like we're going to have a lot of convection, with possibly a couple of clusters getting their act together and forming an embedded low pressure system, which could possibly be severe. Looking at our 500 millibar winds, these are going to be the main cause for forcing for our storms. We can actually see a pretty big shortwave ejecting through the region in the morning hours, which is the reason for that first cluster of storms that we're expected to get. Then with that flow and possibly a couple of kinks back in our jet stream, we could see that second cluster of storms, which would both push out here into Minnesota. And then we do see some troughing back here all the way down into the southwest and across the central plains, which is for the reason for that widespread convection and thunderstorm activity down in this region. Then, of course, we see that large ridge digging in, which is going to help to pinch some of our airflow and enhance that flow up here. And then also bringing that very extreme heat wave to much of the central and southeastern US. Then we even have some flow down here in our southeastern risk area, which could possibly bring that threat for a couple of severe storms. Now, something to note is that these are 700 millibar winds, and they're going to be blowing very strongly into our clusters of storms today, which can help to extend that wind threat further back into the line and also strengthen and sustain storms for longer. And then also this could also help with the threat of a couple of spin-up tornadoes along our lines. Here is a weather sounding from along the outflow boundary up in our northern plains risk area, and immediately we can see a curve and a nice straining out on our photograph. Because it is going to be along the outflow boundary, there is some good wind shear, so that is why there is always that threat of possibly a couple of tornadoes along that outflow boundary. Then we have some good organizing shear, which could mean a couple of organized storms coupled with some wind veering, which will also bring that threat for some organized storms as well. We have quite a bit of cape up here near our freezing level. Then our mid-level lapse rates are going to be quite high at 9 Celsius, decreasing per kilometer. So that, coupled with some strong updrafts, potentially could be the reason for some large hail. But that large hail would come in the earlier stages of this storm because it's expected to be mostly linear. Our lowest cloud level is low enough to support that conditional hail threat, but most of all, it's going to be extremely moist for the region and very unstable at around 4,500 Cape. So extremely favorable for severe weather. Our precipitable water is also going to be quite high, which is one of the reasons for that severe wind threat, and also that flooding threat. Then our downdraft Cape is going to be 1,300, which would also support that threat for some damaging winds. And our 3 Cape is going to be 100, which will support that threat for all hazards of severe weather, including possibly a couple of weak tornadoes. So mostly out here in the northern plains along that outflow boundary, there is going to be that threat of all hazards of severe weather with that line. But on storms which are not on that outflow boundary, they are likely to be a bit more higher based and just be a wind and hail threat. Now, something to note along this line is that there is going to be a round 2, with this line being the round 2. So the first storm in front of it has left a bit more of a stable air mass. So that definitely leaves some questions about how strong this cluster will actually be. But there is fairly high confidence that this cluster will bring some damaging gusts and some large hail at least. And here's the weather sounding from a bit more west in the northern plains. We can see what I was talking about with these straight hertographs and really a lack of shear with our storms not on the outflow boundary. We still do have some decent wind variant, and then we have very strong organizing shear. So that is the reason why these storms not on the outflow boundary are expected to be mostly just wind and hail threats. And this is a weather sounding from our southeastern risk area. And the main thing down here is going to be a very moist environment coupled with a pretty unstable environment around 2000 Cape. So extremely favorable for severe weather today out here. And our 3 Cape is going to be pretty high as well at 100, which will also just feel that general severe weather threat. Then our precipitable water is going to be pretty high, which could definitely bring some stronger downdrafts, so some damaging winds possibly, and then also that flooding threat. So this is why the environment down here has that conditional threat for severe weather. And the main threat with these storms would possibly be some damaging gusts around 60 miles an hour. And our last environment is out here in the southwest. We do see a couple of things which would make it conditional for some severe weather. We see a pretty moist environment for the region coupled with a modestly unstable environment nearing 1700 joules per kilogram of Cape. We also see a higher base storm mode likely with our LCLs being a bit higher. Then our low level lapse rates are also going to be pretty high. So another reason why I do think we could see some storms bring some damaging gusts around 60 miles an hour. And I actually wouldn't rule out the possibility of some small hail between 3/4 of an inch to an inch in diameter.